Frank with her. This is my mother. She's going to talk about some adventures in museum and institutional philanthropy. So I hope everybody enjoys it. Take it away, Mom.
Okie dokie. Well, I've been asked to start by introducing myself. And of course, my claim to fame is I'm Dave Moss's mother. Well, don't.
This is the introduction.
No. I want to say something about the first picture.
Oh, okay.
Right. When I still had, my not quite original hair color. And this was taken at the first unfunded list symposium at George Washington University, and that is Arrowmaker, about whom I will speak in a minute. All right, so now we're moving on to what
The
I
photo
now look
credit
like.
goes to Andy Del Judas.
Right, right. And I will explain a little bit about myself. I'm originally from Boston, and this picture was actually taken at Elm Bank in Wellesley, Massachusetts, close to where I grew up in Newton, and actually near where I went to college at Wellesley. My mother's family is the Rose family, which will be of importance in a second, and from Brookline, Massachusetts. I grew up in Newton. And I did a PhD in French literature at Yale University, and then had a 42-year teaching career, 30 years at Colby College in Maine, which will be important in a second, and then the last time at Duke University, where I was the director of Canadian Studies. And I have little real experience in philanthropy and fundraising. I've been supportive of Unfunded List, and I've been on the Unfunded List board, and I've been I've been evaluating proposals since the very first round. But what I'm going to talk about today is sort of donations and receiving gifts and giving gifts to cultural and educational institutions. Anyway, so this is what I looked like last summer, and moving right along. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about first is sort of part now of my family history. My great uncle, I think, I don't know if he's a cousin twice removed or whatever, but remember, he was my grandfather's cousin, was named Edward Rose, and he gave the gift that and which allowed him to have it named after him, for the building for the Brandeis Art Museum, which is called the Rose Art Museum. And here it is. It opened, I believe, in 1961. And he gave some of his own personal collections, but the money for the building, and actually also money for upkeep. Now, the Rose incident, there's actually two of them. In 1991, the directors of the Rose decided that they wanted to concentrate on very contemporary art, 20th and 21st century. So they sold off, and it was a very big deal at the time, they sold off some fairly, important paintings, 19th century, some Toulouse-Lautrec, some Vuillard, French Impressionist stuff. They sold it and raised money, and which they used to buy more contemporary art. They also asked the family at the time if they could sell off some of the original gift from my Uncle Ed, which was 18th century Dresden porcelain. Go figure. Any event. Now, the event that was the real cause célèbre in particularly in college and university museum circles was in 2009, as you may remember or may not, depending how young you are. In 2008, we had pretty much a global financial crisis. In the United States, it sort of started with the meltdown of the subprime mortgage markets. And anyway, it was a terrible thing. And a lot of people lost money. The Brandeis suffered a tremendous loss, $79 million deficit in their operating budget. And some of their wealthy donors lost money. So they decided that one way they could raise some cash was to close the Rose Art Gallery and to sell off the art. And they anticipated a $350 million windfall from this, not to mention the money that would be saved in getting rid of all the people who worked at the Rose and closing the building. Huge brouhaha, or kerfuffle, as Dave prefers, ensued. And this was, they announced it in January 2009. Members of the Rose family, my brother, who's a lawyer, and a cousins, who's another lawyer, they weren't taking this lying down. So they went to the Attorney General of Massachusetts, and I don't know if it was a lawsuit or whatever. They filed a complaint, and it turns out that there are the laws for charitable gifts and trusts covers this kind of thing. The Attorney General basically stopped the sale, saying that it was a violation of the original gift from my Uncle Ed, and more actually importantly in terms of the money, from some of the wealthy donors who had given art pieces of art. So the sale was stopped, and it really became a big deal in art institution circles. The Association for Art Museum Directors, the AAMD, got involved, and they, at this point, sort of revised their policy on giving. These two instances were not the first time that art museums had attempted to raise funds by selling art. And I must say, they have a lovely word. They don't say selling the art, they say de-accessioning the term of art, as it were, de-accessioning. So they don't sell the art, they de-accession. And there had been instances earlier on of particularly of institutions that did not have large endowments and had more money in the art than they really that they couldn't use for other purposes. So there were a couple instances of art galleries selling off art, or excuse me, de-accessioning. So and very often just to keep the institution open, to pay salaries and for upkeep of the buildings. So in the after the Rose brouhaha, they actually sort of changed the policy and to honor what I'm going to refer to as donor intent. So if the donor gave this piece of art intending it to be on display in a museum, sort of in perpetuity, you couldn't just de-accession, you couldn't just sell it. And in the case of the Rose, the Attorney General raised the issue as to whether Brandeis had informed the Attorney General or had asked for permission. So that sort of became an issue. So the new policy was that, and this, I think it was in the, after the Rose incident in 2009, I think it was in 2011 maybe, the new policy was you could de-accession, i.e. sell the art, but the money had to be used for conservation of the art that they still had, or for, in some instances, to buy new art. And this becomes an issue because, as was the case with the Rose, where they decided that they didn't want 19th century French Impressionists, they only wanted contemporary art, late 20th century, because they were changing the focus of the museum. And this became important for some museums who decided, and remember what's going on in this period, they decided that they could sell art by dead white men. And the term of art was to diversify the collections. So then they would use the money from, selling their French impressionists or whatever, and buy art by women or ethnic groups, African Americans or indigenous art. So that was the sort of the new policy. But the result of the Rose incident was basically a new policy where you had to honor donor intent. And okay, we can move on to the next slide, I think. Is somebody going to do this? Oh, there we go. So here, now I'm going to talk to you about Arrowmaker, which is that's Arrowmaker, and that's on a chest in my front hall. He's no longer there. He's now at Colby College. But anyway, there he is. That was his place of honor. And my new kitten, Rosie, is admiring him. And there's also in the frame behind the portrait bust, and it's about 12 inches tall and 6 inches wide, and it's called it's Carrara marble, and it's referred to as a portrait bust. Behind him is a sheet of stamps issued by the United States Post Office last year to honor the artist, who is Edmonia Lewis. And on the next on the chest of drawers is a book. I actually have a copy of it right here. It's called Child of the Fire, Mary Edmonia Lewis and the Problem of Art History's Black and Indian Subject. And first I'm going to tell you about, because when I started to talk to museums and art critics, art scholars about this statue, I had to do what's called the provenance, right? So this is a portrait bust that was always in my grandparents' apartment in Brookline, Massachusetts, from my various early memories, which would be in the 1950s, because I'm very old, obviously. But any event, this was, I have no idea where it came from. My grandmother, Marion Rose, who was an art lover, and she liked to probably go to galleries in Boston or antique shops and look for things. I have no idea where this came from, absolutely none. When my grandfather died, my mother got the portrait bust, and it was in the den of the house that I grew up in for many years. And then in the, I think probably in 2004, 2005, I was down visiting my mother. I was living in Maine at the time, down visiting her in Newton, Massachusetts. And she said, well, would you like something? Was there anything in the house you'd like? And I said, yeah, I'd always liked that Indian head. So I took Arrowhead home, and he was in our home in Waterville, Maine, and then we brought him down to Pinehurst, North Carolina when we moved. You can see from the and that's referred to as the socle, which of course for a French professor is like chalk, fingernails on a blackboard, because in French it's socle, which basically means the base of a statue. It says Arrowmaker. It is not signed, which of course becomes the problem. And I had made very feeble attempts over time to figure out what exactly it was this was, because anytime an art person who was a real connoisseur or an antique dealer came into the house, their eyes would just get big when they saw Arrowmaker. But didn't really know what it was. Last September, one Sunday, I was bored and Googling. That's what I do now. I'm retired. And I Googled Arrowmaker. And what came up was a picture of a two-figure statue, which was called the Old Arrowmaker, and was by an artist named Mary Edmonia Lewis. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit about Mary Edmonia Lewis, because she's fascinating. She was born in 1844 in upstate New York, Greenbush, New York. Her mother was a Chippewa or Ojibwe Indian. Her father was Haitian, probably a manservant for somebody. She was so she was part indigenous, part of African descent. Her parents died when she was young, and she was taken in by aunts, and probably spent a lot of her childhood on reservation land, probably in the Niagara Peninsula area, back and forth between Canada and the United States. She had an older brother who made some money in the gold rush and was able to send her to a Catholic boarding school, and then she went to Oberlin College. Now we have to remember this would have been in the 1860s during the Civil War. So she spends a few years at Oberlin, And then it's a long story. You can read the book. She leaves Oberlin without a degree and she goes to Boston, where she becomes friends with the sort of abolitionist circles in Boston and sort of gets adopted by some of the, blue stocking ladies. She's Maria Maria Sophia Child and Margaret Fuller. She knew all of the sort of important abolitionists, and she was also in artistic circles. And she starts doing medallions because she needs to get some training. She had a mentor. Somebody had hooked her up with a sculptor, and she got some training. And so she starts doing medallions, which she sells. She did some for instance, Robert Gould Shaw, who was the white man who led the Negro troops in the Civil War. And if you've been to Boston, there's a big bas relief. It's also the movie Glory was based on this. And then anyway, she spent some time in Boston, and then she goes to Europe. She first stops in Paris, and then she ends up in Rome, where she becomes part of sort of an expat um, uh, group of artists, women artists, in Rome, and she starts doing larger pieces. At in Now I'm going to switch a little bit to talk about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Um, People my age and older always had to memorize Longfellow poems. Nobody does them anymore. But one of his more well-known and best-selling poems it was published in 1855 was the Song of Hiawatha. And the Song of Hiawatha was the story of an Ojibwe uh, brave who falls in love with a Dakota woman, and they eventually get married, but then she dies, and blah blah blah. Any event, it's a very famous beginning by the shores of Gitchigumi, by the blah 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 blah. Any event, this inspired Mary Edmonia Lewis to do a series of sculptures, and she did in total she did a two-figure statue of the old arrow maker and Minnehaha, and that's the Dakota woman's name. I love saying it. Hiawatha and Minnehaha. Anyway, and then she did the marriage of Minnehaha and Hiawatha, and that's another two-person statue. And then she did portrait busts, 11, 12-inch portrait busts, and she did multiples, Minnehaha, multiples of Hiawatha. It turns out that I have what seems to be the only arrow maker, and that's why it was hard for me to find it, because she had to make a living through her artwork. So she would make multiple copies, and then and she would come back to the United States and sell them. Very often she would exhibit them here and there, and then she would sell them to collectors who would very often, sometimes they were called cabinet busts. They would go in glass door cabinets. Any event, she also did her most famous statue is probably the Death of Cleopatra, which is now in the Smithsonian, and it was exhibited, I think, in Philadelphia. And then she did some on one. I think it's called the Standing Lincoln, but it's Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves, and there are sort of freed slaves at his knees. And then she did some other portrait busts. And then she has one statue which is in the Mount Auburn Cemetery. It's an outdoor, but she did quite a number, and was fairly well known at the time. As I said, she was good at sort of self promotion. Any event, this Sunday afternoon, I was Googling around and I saw old arrow maker, and the face is obviously exactly the same as my arrow maker. And I sort of then, because being an academic, I did a Google search. Well, excuse me, I did a more academic search in a library catalog, and I found that there were a number of books published on Mary Edmonia Lewis, the sculptor who had done the old arrow maker. So I took a picture and I sent an email to the woman who's the author of the book that you see on the chest there, Her name is Kristen Pade Buick, and she's the director of African American Studies at the University of New Mexico. I sent her a picture, told her my story, my provenance story, and she wrote back immediately and said, "Yes, definitely, this is Edmonia Lewis, and it's unique. I've never seen it. Nobody's ever seen it." And this it didn't surprise her because there are um, um, what are considered lost Lewises. It's known that she did certain things. Not all of them have surfaced. Some of them are probably still with private collectors. She did some for on commission for the Marquis of Bute off of Scotland, an island off of Scotland. So they weren't surprised that this existed. It's just that nobody had seen it. So from her, Kristen Pye Buick, I went and contacted some of the other Lewis scholars, and then everybody agreed that it was definitely a Lewis. And then I decided, it was sort of like the classic antique roadshow story where they, go to the antique roadshow and the expert says, "Oh my God, what you have here is blah blah." And my husband and I watch that. We always say, if it's something really, unique and important, we always say, "Give it to a museum." And so that's what we decided to do. And then the question became, what museum? Are we going to the next slide, Dave?
If you'd like.
Next slide.
This one's about shenanigans.
Oh, this is institutional shenanigans. Okay, so well, just ignore that while I continue. So anyway, at this point, I started contacting museum curators, and two of my friends, my former colleagues from Colby College, when I told them this story, they said, "Well, it should really go to a museum that has other Edmonia Lewis sculptures, so that it can be seen in context, preferably an institution that has the portrait bust of Minnehaha and the portrait bust of Hiawatha."
I guess
And yes, here I am visiting the North Carolina Museum, which just recently, as of October, put on display their recently acquired, and this is the two-person, and I'm standing there for just for a scale, right? So you can see how big it is. I think it's like 23, 24 inches. It's not huge. The features on my arrow maker are actually much larger. So anyway, I talked to, I first talked to museum curators at museums where they had some Edmonia Lewis. Williams College has two. The Smithsonian actually has 6 Edmonia Lewis's. The Metropolitan had just recently acquired the Minnehaha and Hiawatha. Crystal Bridges, which is Alice Walton, Money is No Object Museum in Arkansas. They had acquired one. If you Google Edmonia Lewis, you will see that her statues show up everywhere. There's in Howard University Museum, the Detroit Museum, even the University of Utah Museum has one. They're here, there, and everywhere, but nobody has ever seen one like the one we have. So then it became sort of a question as to, where to give it. And at this point, can we go back to museum shenanigans? So given my family's experience with the Rose, we were a little wary of just giving something like this. And so now I'm going to talk just very briefly about what Dave labels shenanigans, right? And the first one, obviously, is the ignoring donor intent, as was the case with the Rose Art Museum. And so I certainly didn't want to, give this statue to a museum that was not going to display it. And my other thing was I really wanted it to go someplace where it could, where they would loan it out so it could be seen with other from the grouping based on Hiawatha. So ignoring donor intent in cases where it's really blatant and there are some people still alive around to complain, attorneys general will get involved because it is a violation of laws, federal laws governing charitable trusts. Now, the other day there was an article it was Sunday actually in the New York Times, which quoted Leon Botstein, who's the president of Bard College, and Stephen Trachtenberg, who used to be the president of George Washington. And they were talking about how very often when, when you're, this is not necessarily museums, but when you're running, a big institution and you're always fundraising and you really need money, you sometimes brings you to have to go solicit money from unsavory characters. And Botstein was talking about making many, like maybe a dozen trips down to New York to try to get some money out of Jeffrey Epstein. And it turns out that Epstein gave what between $8.5 and $9 million to both MIT and Harvard, right? And then sometimes, well, in one instance, it's a story of redemption. Michael Milken, who actually went to jail for junk bonds and insider trading, and he had given lots and lots of money to various institutions, and they felt compelled to take their names off of because he had asked that his money sort of buy the naming of a building. But when he got out of prison, he sort of went straight and he started giving millions and millions for medical research because he was a cancer survivor himself. So he's sort of redeemed himself, and people are naming things Milken. And of course, lately we've all talked.
First summit was at a building used by the Milken School of Health.
Ah, right. But a lot of medical research institutes, but and then the other unsavory, well, they just became unsavory during the opioid crisis. The Sackler family, as you know, there's actually a Sackler Museum, part of the Smithsonian, and there's also, I think there's a Sackler. I don't know if it's at the Tate or there's a Sackler wing in London, whether it's at the National Gallery or whatever. But and then the big debate is you take the name off of the building. And then the third one we listed is ideologically motivated gifts or gifts that violate the mission. And this is my example here is, and with apologies to a friend of mine who was the dean at George Mason, but this is about, things like what happened at George Mason University, where they took a lot of dark money. It turns out some of it was Koch brothers, and some of it was from a Chicago billionaire name, and I don't know how to pronounce it, Barre, and the last name is Seid, Seid. And he's given a lot of money to the Federalist Society, who gave us the Supreme Court that we have today. He's given a lot of money to Hillsdale College, to Sherman College, and he gave a lot of money that changed the name of the George Mason Law School to Antonin Scalia. And in this instance, the money was frankly meant to buy influence, and they demanded to have some say over personnel decisions. So they were really, violating the academic or the institution, except the money was willing to sort of, I'd like to say prostitute. Oh, well, I'll say it. Prostitute their academic principles, academic freedom and independence. And it really is a violation, as Davis put on the slide, of the mission of the college. And so this term, violating the mission or the goals of the institution, can be used. There's an earlier example, and it's from the early 1990s. And it's sort of at the beginning of the culture wars. And it involves the Bass family, and they were Texas gazillionaires, oil industry. And Lee Bass wanted to give $20 million to Yale University. All of the Basses went to Yale. And they wanted to give the money to Yale. And this was to promote courses and on Western civilization. It wanted really to put Western civilization and the study thereof at the center of the academic mission of the undergraduate school. And you might remember this was the period where, women's studies, Latino studies, Puerto Rican studies, African American studies, and probably a couple of years later, gay and lesbian studies, were starting to become more and more part of liberal arts education. So he was going to give $20 million, and this was going to support 7 chaired professors and 4 the assistant professors, and all Yale undergraduates were going to be required to take a 2-semester course sophomore year on Western civilization. And they also wanted a say in who got the chairs, who got tenure, etc. Well, the faculty just went crazy, and eventually Yale gave the money back. They gave back $20 million, and so that was sort of a model for what, a few fights that came later, where donors giving major amounts of money, but sort of demanding to have uh, approval or a say so in hiring and promotion of faculty and in what courses got taught. And that goes to the last thing on the list: gift agreements that disrupt academic freedom. Because in some instances, there were probably development officers, and I apologize if there are any development officers listening to this, but there were probably some development officers who were willing to write into agreements some provisions that probably would have been rejected, which led to many institutions developing policies for gift acceptance. And I think I'll tell one more anecdote. In the article that appeared in the New York Times on Sunday, Stephen Trachtenberg, who was the former president of GW, tells this story, almost regretfully, that he turned down a large donation from the Church of Scientology because it came with strings. And the string was they wanted L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of the Church of Scientology, to receive an honorary degree. Evidently, he was a graduate of George Washington, and Trachtenberg wasn't willing to go there. So, in any event, all of this is to say that there are ethics involved in accepting gifts. And to what extent you're going to honor donor agreements and do what they want, if there are strings attached, if it sort of forces you to skew the academic goals and missions of a college. I have a really good friend who teaches at New College in Florida, and this isn't a case of a wealthy donor giving a lot of money to do this. This is a case of Ron DeSantis and the Florida Republican legislature deciding that they wanted to change the mission, the academic mission of the college. And of course, we've all been reading about this. He fired the president, installed his own board of trustees, and they are now forcing changes and threatening to get rid of people who have tenure. So, I mean, as you can see, there are all kinds of issues involved, not only in art galleries and art museums, but also in academic institutions.
Yes, I've been given some moderators protocol.
Oh,
right? It sounds like we're wrapping up on this slide, but we want to move on.
Oh, yes, we are. Go ahead.
These are big. These are all very big topics.
Right, they are big topics.
Those news stories mentioned
Next slide.
are worth looking at. But we do mention that we I think one thing that to add is that you might do everything right, like follow all the right rules, donate, a nice bust somewhere. You want to make sure that they're not taking gifts from unsavory characters or doing some other things. You end up the place that you just donated to ends up in the news for bad reasons or other things, right? These are all some considerations if you're going to make gifts to a large institution, or especially an academic one. And museums are fun, even if they don't have a college attached, which they often do. They're fundamentally educational institutions, right? And they have an academic mission, and they're trying to educate the public. So these were just some things on the mind as you decided, right? And we also went to
right. So so we went to the North Carolina Museum, who, as I said, had recently acquired an arrow maker, and from a private collector in the Upper West Side of New York. And we looked at that because that's only an hour from my house. And I thought, well, if I give it there, I could go visit it. But they had displayed it in a room of, and you can see behind me, 19th century American art, lots of pictures of the American West, which made a little bit of sense because even though she was mother Ojibwe and father Haitian, she did not sort of fit under the rubric of African American art or tribal art. And as Dave reminded me, there is a room of tribal art not far from where this is displayed. So this is displayed with the neoclassical 19th century American art. So I thought about that. Next slide.
This is going to be the list of.
Right. So these are the things that I tried to consider before donating the portrait bust, and there he is in profile, picture by Dave Moss. Right. My not only did I teach at Colby for 30 years, and my husband taught there for close to that, 27 years, but my mother, from whom I received this gift, was Colby class of 1940. And her sister, who was also a member of the Rose family, went there with a whole lot of Colby connections. When I talked to them, and when you give a gift of art, you sign what's called the deed of gift. And of course, galleries just want you to give it to them, and you know, in terms that basically say they can do whatever they want. They can consult you, but they can sell it, or excuse me, de-accession as they see fit. So I was really concerned about this piece because I wanted to make sure, because I had talked to so many museum curators who had other Edmonia Lewises from the same series. I wanted it to be available for loan because I think it's important. And they guaranteed me that it would be used in courses to teach students, both in courses on women's art, in African American art, in Native American studies. Of course, there's the tax consideration because I didn't want to sell it. I wanted to give it, but I wasn't beneath taking the tax deduction. And then I wanted to make sure that it would, when Dave writes needed, that meant, you know, is the Smithsonian has so many, so much of so many, you know, that I figured they really didn't need my, you know, little portrait busts. And we thought long and hard about the Met. First of all, the curator from the Met came down to see it, and she was a lovely woman. And she said, well, you know, how many millions of visitors go to the Met every year? We thought, well, that'd be great, but you know, then we'd have to go to New York to visit it. Since Dave lives a couple miles from the Colby College Museum of Art, I figured at least I'd get to visit. So we decided finally to give it to Colby, and they promised me that it would be displayed in the Lunder wing of American art at Colby. And Colby has a terrific collection of, well, it's a terrific art museum, but they have a terrific collection of 19th century art in particular, thanks to Peter and Paula Lunder. So we finally decided, and I must say, considerations for donating. I felt that even though I had it, my husband kept saying, it's yours, it's your family. I felt, first of all, I had to consult David because, you know, it would have been his. And I had to consult my brother, you know, they're, you know, because the same family, and my cousin. So I wanted to talk to everybody in the family who had gone to Colby and who was part of the Rose family. Everybody was really happy with the choice of Colby. So now you're going to, all right. Oh, okay. You go the last slide, Dave.
Oh yes, someone just chatted in. Thank you.
Right. So here we are. This is the Colby Art Museum, or one building of it. The building to the right, the brick one, is also the art museum. I believe that
it's all art. That whole block is art museum now.
Yeah, they have all kinds of terrific art. And anyway, it left here on Tuesday. It's already there. It's got to be looked over by a conservator, but it will be on display in the Lunder wing. And the gift, it'll be labeled, as you can see, gift of Jane, Richard, and David Moss in honor. And this is my mother, my brother, my niece, my aunt, and my cousin. So as I said, it all made me feel really good, which is to say that, you know, that when you make a gift, you should think of the, you know, where it's going, if the people will use it appropriately, if you have a connection of some sort, you know, and it should all be for the good reasons, not just to, you know, splash your name on a building, or, you know, to rehabilitate yourself, or in the case of Charles Kushner, $2.5 million to Harvard to buy admittance for your son. Oh, I'm sorry, that was nasty, but there, I'll end on that.
That was fun.
And my cat just arrived.
Oh, do we have a visitor?
Sunny.
Hello, Sonny.
This Sunny just arrived. Okay.
Thank you very much for the presentation. That Arrowmaker could have been funding unfunded list
Yes.
for now.
Right.
But
Could
which
have.
goes, I'm very happy with the decision.
Right.
I pretty much immediately said, let's donate it. She's an important artist, belongs in a museum. One of my favorite movies growing up were the Indiana Jones movies. And it's one of his big lines, Indiana Jones. He says, it belongs in a museum.
Yeah.
And it's cool that I'm basically Indiana Jones. Right? Very cool. If there are any questions, Mom can stick around for a moment. But probably end the recording around now. Put some cool closing music in there. Do you have any closing remarks to say, Mom?
No, I'd just like to say that this was really fun. When Dave, asked me to do this, frankly, because he had come up with this great title, I felt like I had to do it. And this has been much on my mind in the last week or so, as we got ready to say goodbye to Arrowmaker. But at least I know I can go visit him.
Yes, and as she mentioned, I live about 5 miles away from this particular museum. And I go there. It's free and open to the public, which is really cool. I go there all the time. It has a bunch of other important pieces of art here in Waterville, Maine.
Right.
Everybody, if you're ever visiting, please let me know. I'm here. We can hang out and go to the museum, take a look at Arrowmaker. Hopefully, they'll give me some good treatment.
Right.
Mom's
or when you go to either the Met or the Smithsonian or another museum that has an Edmonia Lewis, you can say, well, I know all about, an Edmonia Lewis that nobody else knows about because it was a lost Lewis. Right. There you can
stand next to it and talk loudly about that.
Right.
It's a good thing to do at museums.
Right.
And send us yourself, take a selfie with that Lewis if you find one out there and send it to us. We'd love to see it. Thank you, Mom. Always a pleasure to have you content create with us. You're a content creator.
Whoa.
Did you know about that? When you see it on the news tonight, you'll be able to say that's what you are.
The next step is TikToks, right?
There was a fairly big news development while we were recording. There has been a verdict in a jury. You should go.
Oh, yes?
Everybody should go and check out the news. Yes, I think you'll like what you hear.
Okay.
I'm sure everybody liked what they just heard with that recording. And if you're ever in a position to donate an old neoclassical style American bust, right? I hope that this was useful for you, and for whatever other reason you might want.
Do your homework.
Very interesting stuff. This was fun. It was fun to go through all of this process and all of that. Great job. Cool presentation. Have a good evening. I've got chicken tacos on the menu.
Right.
Ooh,
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Take it easy.